Welcome to All About Money on HKIBC. I'm Chloe Foam. No matter where you are from, 2022 has been turbulent in many aspects. COVID lockdowns in China led to global supply chain disruptions, while in Europe, the war in Ukraine has triggered an energy crisis, which sent gas and electricity prices soaring. While order seems to be gradually restored in the second half of this year, the outlook is marked by a looming global recession, as well as rising geopolitical tensions. So what are the biggest lessons we can learn from this year, and what can we expect as we move forward? Joining us today on this special year-end episode to share her insights is Alicia Garcia Herrero, Chief Asia-Pacific Economist at French investment bank Natixis. So Alicia, it's great to have you today.
It is my pleasure to be here with you.
So I'm thinking if we could review this year in a very, very short one word, from your point of view, what would that word you would think in your mind to describe this year?
I think the word will be closure, because energy crisis has kind of closed Europe's future in terms of a big rebound after COVID. And in China, we had closure because of zero COVID. So in a way, closure is the word that, to me, describes the year best.
And interesting. And speaking of all of those major past events, we have a tumultuous years with, roller coaster events, ups and downs. If we could summarize this year with, different major events, what would be the top 5 events from your perspective that cause, significant impact on our societies from the economic perspective?
Well, I would start with the war, in Ukraine, because that war is not only about Europe, it's about an attempt to change the global order, the global liberal order. And that is why this war basically involves many parts, depending on their attitude to this change in the global order. So far, the change has not been successful. So I would argue that not only the first event is the invasion of Ukraine, but the second is the failed attempt of the invasion of Ukraine, which is also a major event, because at the very beginning, as you remember, this was not expected. It was supposed to be a 2-day war. So these are the 2 first events. The third is zero COVID in China. I think is extremely important for the world. And the fourth is the opening and literally, like light speed, opening up in China, which is another unbelievable event given what we've seen before. And I think the fifth and final is a massive increase in interest rates across the board, especially in the US, but also in emerging economies following the Fed and also their own inflationary environment. So I think these are the 5 events I would focus on.
Thank you for sharing, Alicia. Actually, my top 5 choices will be kind of like similar with yours. So my top 1 would, of course, will be the war in Ukraine. It came absolutely in a very stunning way. Nobody expect that. And the second on my top list would be the famine and actually the floods, following the extreme weather we have seen during the summertime, extreme hot temperatures, this is becoming more tangible. And the third one would be the more, the showing up of more subvariants of Omicron with lowered toxicity. So it paved the way for countries to gradually open up, as we have seen, the last one probably be China, and thereby providing chances that the world could return to normality. And my fourth will be the record high inflations, in major economies that triggered the U.S. Federal Reserve's very aggressive interest rate hikes, as you also mentioned, and sparked, now the recessionary fears following the property woes. And my first choice would probably be President Xi Jinping's, unprecedented third term, though, and China's white paper protests that led to a surprising easing in China in terms of the COVID policy. And finally, I would like to also add a bit more about renewed Sino-US tensions over the economy and tech disputes, and also over Taiwan. And if we also think about those events, what do you think we can learn are the biggest lessons from these major events, what we can think and reflect from them as we move forward towards 2023?
Your events are really very good, so I want to ponder on some of your ideas. And I think what really comes to mind when you put all of that together is that nobody, no country, no leader is almighty. And let me give you the example of Biden, just to start, or maybe I could start with Putin. Yeah, I mean, my second event is that Putin didn't make it. That says a lot about how different reality is from what leaders think it is. And this is true for Biden, because Biden was really convinced that, China would probably understand the US red lines in many ways. And I think the latest chip ban shows that the US has to put much more on the table to even have China listen, so because the US is not as mighty as the US think it is. And I think that's another very, very important learning lesson for this year. And then, of course, for Xi Jinping, in my view, yes, apparently absolutely mighty given the results of the party congress. But when you look at what has happened with zero COVID right after the protest, and I would not highlight so much a protest, but I would also highlight workers' reaction to closed loop operations in factories in China, because I think that's also very important. So if you look at all of that, nobody's mighty enough. The reality is very complex to everybody, including our leaders. So I think that's a lesson from this year.
Interesting. The factory disruption actually seriously impacted the global supply chain, and also, with other tensions as well. And if we, review the Ukraine war, I mean, what is your biggest concern now with the prolonged war?
Well, to me, I think the concern is, what is Russia going to do? This is my concern, because I think by now we realize that, after days of strike, basically now we are on the drone venture. Yeah, many of these drones come from Iran. This is quite strange, because I was unaware that Iran produced so many drones. But, it's like Russia by now is drawing on Iranian drones to win this war. It's like we are exhausting basically the chances, unless we move to nuclear, which I think Russia will not dare do, because everybody, including China, has said that's not an option. So now, what will Russia do? I mean, Putin has even canceled his latest press conference. I think we are at a time where we need to focus on Russia. Maybe not on Ukraine, on Russia, because this is a major challenge for the world. We need to find an exit in a way. We need to find a way for Russia to stabilize. And I think this is where we are now. And we have to think this thoroughly. And I think we can learn a lot of things from Asian values, which is, face saving, and how we get out of this without additional disruption. But I think that's where we are now.
And also, speaking of the ways that we can do to, try to speed up the end of the war, China actually plays a, very important role as well. What do you think China can do in order to also help speed up the end of the war?
Well, China could do lots, because, of course, Russia highly depends on China, not so much for exports, also exports, but I think that's not the key. Because China can export basically cheap gas and oil to, especially oil, because gas, unfortunately, the pipelines are not linked, but oil to India or other places, Indonesia. So I think the key is not so much the exports, but the imports. Russia needs China's imports. But the point is, why would China do it? I mean, what is it in for China? And I think that's basically why we're not yet seeing a major kind of helping hand, at least from the Western perspective, from China, because China needs to see what is it in for China, meaning the leverage. Yeah, I mean, what in exchange for what? And I think if we saw tariffs being lifted, the chips ban being lifted, maybe China would consider. But I don't think the West will do that because of the reason I mentioned, because I think Russia is losing the war. And it's a question of time. It is a painful time, but I think it would be more painful, in my view, for the Biden administration to have to negotiate with China using China's leverage, because it would go against the principle of why the West is fighting this war. It's not only about Ukraine, it's about the global liberal order. So I think this is why the war will probably continue in as far as Russia has resources to do that. So, but as I said, I think Russia is running out of steam.
It also shows a remarkably resilient spirit, as we've seen over the past year as well. Thank you very much for your thoughts, Alicia. We will take a short break for now, but coming up next, we'll continue our discussions of the year in review for 2022, so do stay tuned. Welcome back to the second half of All About Money on HKIBC. I'm Chloe Fong. Joining us today on this special year-end episode to share her insights is Alicia Garcia Herrero, Chief Asia-Pacific Economist at French investment bank Natixis. So it's great to have you today, Alicia. So earlier we have reviewed some of the major events happening in 2022. So now I also want to, shift our focus on another phenomenon that we have seen not only from this year, but also from the past 3 years. Over the past 3 years, we've seen a wave of growing nationalism since the coronavirus emerged in China's Wuhan city that sent countries scrambling to store whatever supplies they can find for their own citizens to protect these people. And this phenomenon, along with the previous border restrictions, the closure, as you just mentioned, and also the rising geopolitical tensions, also amplified the trend of deglobalization. I'm not sure if you agree with me or not. And also a factoring in certain industries, for example, in semiconductor industries, in the EV battery industries, in critical minerals. And do you see this trend is true or not? And do you think this trend will continue next year or reverse, actually, as we move forward?
Thank you so much. Well, let me be brief and concise on the answer. It will continue. It will accelerate. And then we can talk the details. But I want to give you my take on this. I think we're just at the beginning of a globalization, perhaps I should say, rather than deglobalization, because, when you use this big word, deglobalization, people get very scared. It sounds like the world is going to go back to the Cold War, where, you would need, all kinds of visas, if any at all. I mean, like very hard to obtain visas to go to one part of the world. Well, I mean, let's be frank. Borders have been closed on and off for 3 years in different locations, and we're back now with the big, opening up of China. Already now, I mean, some are closing because they worry about fast mutations of the virus. So, we're not over with constraints, put it this way, in people-to-people movement in all over the world and in every direction. So I'm not picking up on one direction because it's multi-directional. And I think that's one clear, reduction of mobility, basically, of people across borders. And then on supply chains, I think what is happening is that they are becoming shorter. What I mean to say is that countries are learning that when you are excessively dependent on the sourcing of whatever good, now it could be ibuprofen for that matter, yeah, like 99% is produced in China. So people just feel very, very uneasy because they just can't control the sourcing of what could be a critical good at this time, pharmaceutical product, in times of major fever or major contagion. So this is not going to go away. I think people will ask their politicians basically to keep at least a bare minimum, so kind of strategic reserves of everything that they think is necessary at some point in time. And this is pharmaceutical, this is food, this is energy, and this is semiconductors. It's like anything that is necessary to continue to keep your standard of living, basically. And these are lots of things. So yeah, my take is that we'll all try to not produce everything. I think that's too expensive to happen, but try to control. So maybe you want a strategic, agreement with the neighboring country, so that you can produce there 20% of what you import rather than import 90% from China. So maybe you still keep China's imports, but you make sure that they don't go beyond a certain percentage. I think many countries are going to set these percentages just to make sure that they are not too dependent. And I think that this is going to reshuffle supply chains. So that's one more change. And then investment. There's lots of restrictions to investment now everywhere, in Japan, in South Korea, in the US, increasingly in Europe. So it is not easy to go and buy companies or even set your company in a different jurisdiction. So that's, again, another sign of globalization. I don't dare call it deglobalization fully because, again, it's very negative, but I think we need to understand what the trend really is about. And this is the trend we will see in 2023.
And also about the diversification of their supply chain as well. And speaking of China's economy, you mentioned about the key issue or major event from your point of view for 2022 would be China's reopening. And now China is easing its COVID curves following, the nationwide protest, and we could probably see an earlier than expected reopening if that really happens. What is your forecast for Chinese economic growth for next year? You said is below 3%?
Actually, for 2022, it's below 3%. For 2023, our forecast is 5.5%, which is higher than what we heard from Li Keqiang at the Politburo and then repeated in the China Economic Work Conference. And I think the reason is Work Economic Conference. And I think the reason is that we actually think the opening up is happening very fast. And that's going to bring growth at some point. I have to say that I think December will be really poor because, again, people are not going to work. So, this is going to have an impact on industrial production. I don't think people are consuming too much because, they still feel that the wave is not yet peaking. It might soon peak in Beijing, but the whole country might peak sometime. I mean, the economist says early January, maybe others I've seen March. In the first quarter, let's put it this way. So the best will start in the second quarter. So because the first quarter was good last year, actually, the base effect is negative, as we say, we economists. So it's not going to be higher than 5.5% in my view. But this fast recovery in the second quarter could be humongous, something like 18% growth or something, because remember that the second quarter last year was terrible. This was Shanghai lockdown. So everybody will be surprised by very high growth in China in the second quarter. But bear in mind, it is just kind of a lot of statistics behind. I mean, it's a statistical effect. And of course, the rather bad the first quarter, because it's not yet peaking. It's going to peak only then. So all in all, the second quarter will be terrible for the rest of the world. Let me explain you why. Because China will be back there. Energy demand will be huge, and inflationary pressures might actually rebound in the rest of the world because China will put a lot of pressure on imports of materials, etc. And that's why I think the Fed might actually not peak because they may see more inflation than they're expecting because of China. I think that explains partially why Powell was a little bit hesitant and saying, well, we're not sure yet. I think it's China's reopening. So China's reopening is a humongous event for 2023, humongous.
And also, I know you're joining us from Taipei now, right? And speaking of China and the Taiwan relations, what can we expect next year from your point of view? Do you think we can see a possible improvement in the tie?
Yeah. I think we've already seen a slight improvement, maybe because, the Kuomintang won the local elections, and many people say local elections are not important. I don't agree with that, because I already saw the 2014-15 when DPP actually won the elections unexpectedly, local elections, and then finally the presidential elections. So I do think local elections are important, and you can sense that now there's more of a this idea that we need to get our act together. The economy is slowing down here too because of the semiconductor cycle. Is a very negative shock for Taiwan. And I think people are just now thinking, okay, are we going to be as well off as we've been during COVID? Because during COVID, Taiwan was growing faster than ever. So it's kind of strange, but that's what it was. 2020 is record growth for Taiwan for many years. So now I think Taiwanese are starting to think economic issues, and therefore I think there's a chance that tensions abide somewhat because of this. Also, China has other things on the table. The successful reopening is such a huge endeavor. So I would imagine that the 23, at least the first half, is going to be calmer. I think also, midterm elections are over. The Congress is divided. I mean, it's actually Congress is, of course, Republican, but it's a very divided political situation in the U.S. So my sense is good for the cross-strait relations now. It's better than last year for sure. Last year we had all kinds of political events from China to the U.S. to Taiwan. Now we don't have that.
And also, very quickly, Alicia, do you think we could really see a recession next year? It's not only from probably in the U.S., and probably how would it also affect the Asia-Pacific area?
Yeah. Well, I have to say that in our Asia economic outlook, Natixis, we already had a deceleration everywhere in Asia except China, in a nutshell. And this is because 2022 was very good for everybody except China. I mean, Japan, South Korea, slightly less, but still better than expected. And I think, frankly, we all realize that 2023 is going to be harder because we are getting at least in technical recession in the US, certainly recession in the UK, and technical recession in Europe. So will these technical recessions, what I mean to say is 2 quarters of negative growth, become a full-fledged recession in 2023? Well, I would have said until recently, until the Fed, I mean, last week, Fed and ECB held their press conferences and their decisions, I would have said maybe not, maybe just stagnation. But frankly, their language was extremely aggressive. And we're heading towards higher rates, both in the US and especially in Europe, probably 3.5 rather than 2.5. So that is a shock for the global economy and of course for the US and Europe. And this means that we might indeed have full recession, maybe mild recession, but full recession in the US and Europe. And that's bad news for Asia. So in a nutshell, think about deceleration everywhere but China. China cannot decelerate because we're starting from probably below 3. So China will indeed grow. I mean, but that doesn't mean the whole region will do better because they are very influenced by US Fed hikes and generally the general kind of negative sentiment globally. So yeah, that's our call for next year for Asia.
One last question. What would be your suggestions for all of the investors as well, in face of all these turmoils, uncertainties, recessionary fears? What would you suggest they do in terms of the investment strategies to navigate through this tough climate next year?
Well, if you are an investor and not a borrower, you're fine. You're fine because, of course, you have still high inflation. But bear in mind that 2022 was a year of negative real rates. Yeah, that's clear, except in China. But barring China, where we had other problems, those negative real interest rates will become positive because inflation is going to go down. It's already going down. Barring again a very messy opening up in China and supply chain disruptions. If we avoid that scenario, which is to me a risk scenario, we'll have higher real rates. This means I would just go, like short and cash. I mean, like basically short-term money market. I mean, nobody would have ever dreamed of getting the rate you're getting, even in real terms. Yeah. In China, I would invest in the sectors that are related to the opening up.
Right. Thank you very much for your thoughts, Alicia. I appreciate your time. And also to all of our viewers who tuned in on HKIBC, we wish you a very happy, healthy, and also prosperous New Year's ahead. Merry Christmas, and please take care.